Two cars, one silver, one blue, tear through the curves of US Highway 50 above Lake Tahoe. You can hear the engines echo off the granite walls as the tires claw for grip on the mountain's edge. For miles they're side by side, until one starts to fall back. The driver in the rear car watches his taillights disappear around the bend and sets his jaw. For Carroll Shelby, that just wasn't going to do. What Shelby built after that mountain run wasn't just another one of his Cobras. It was something different, something wild and untamed and dangerous, even by his standards. Only two were ever made. One vanished forever, and the other became a true legend. Well, today we've got a story about US 50 that we've titled The Highway, the Hot Rodder, and the Super Snake. It's all about Carroll Shelby's most dangerous car as we go beyond the exit. Before we can talk about the car called the Super Snake, we need to talk about the road that made it possible. Because this stretch of US 50 carved through the Sierra Nevadas, well, it's been testing people for more than a century. The highway. Before US 50 was a highway, it was a trail. A rough line scratched across the Sierra Nevada long before there were pavement crews or guardrails. In 1852, a man named John Calhoun Johnson, a mail carrier turned trailblazer, mapped a safer way across the mountain. His shortcut became known as Johnson's Cutoff, linking Placerville, California and Carson Valley, Nevada, and giving Gold Rush travelers an alternate to the dangerous Donner Pass. Wagons creaked through the American River Canyon, climbing past places like Strawberry Lodge and Echo Summit. Grades were so steep that families sometimes unloaded their wagons and hauled them up by hand. By the 1860s, the path had become the Lake Tahoe Wagon Road, a lifeline between Sacramento's markets and the silver mines of Virginia City. As California grew, so did the need for better roads. And in 1896, the state legislature made the Lake Tahoe Wagon Road its first official state highway. Then came the automobile. By 1915, the route was folded into a second, southern route of the Lincoln Highway across the mountains, the northern path located at Donner Pass. 13 years later, when the federal highway system took shape, it earned a new designation, U.S. Route 50, stretching nearly coast to coast from Ocean City, Maryland to Sacramento, California. The Sierra segment remained one of its toughest tests. Here, the road climbs above 7,000 feet through granite outcrops and alpine snowfields. Later generations came for the scenery and to unwind in a very beautiful place. And some came for the thrill of taking the curves a lot faster than what the speed limit signs allowed. The Hot Rodder. Enter Carroll Shelby, a name already known around the world by the mid-1960s. A Texas-born racer turned builder, he had helped Ford beat Ferrari at Le Mans and turned the small British AC Roadster into the thundering Shelby Cobra. This was mainly because a heart condition had ended his driving career. For most men, that might have been the story's end, but for Carroll Shelby, it was just another starting line. He turned his competitiveness toward building faster cars and assembling a team to help him do it. When he wasn't at his Los Angeles shop, Shelby spent time at a cabin near Lake Tahoe, one of his favorite retreats. The air was thin and the roads were quiet, and Highway 50 offered the kind of mountain drive that could clear your head. It was also a place that attracted friends who shared his appetite for speed. One of them was J. Stanley Mullen, a Los Angeles attorney with a Ferrari 275 GTB. Silver, elegant, and fast, even by Italian standards. Mullen was one of the early private Ferrari owners in Southern California, part of a small circle that bought cars directly through importer Luigi Chinetti. When both men were at Tahoe, the rivalry often followed them out onto the highway. According to those who knew them, the two would set out early on clear mornings, Shelby in a Cobra 427 and Mullen in his Ferrari, winding east toward the summit. At that altitude, carburetors gasped for air and engines ran rich. The Ferrari's 12-cylinder adapted better to the climb. The Cobra's big V8 lost some of its edge in the thin air. By the time they reached the crest, the Ferrari was usually a few turns ahead. For most drivers, that was nothing more than a good story to tell back at the cabin. Carroll Shelby wasn't built to finish second, not to Ferrari and not on the road that he loved. Somewhere on that mountain, the idea took hold. If the altitude cost him power, he'd build a car that didn't care. One that could breathe thin air and still pull like a freight train. When he got back to his shop at LAX, Shelby walked in with that thought still burning in his head. He pointed to an unused Cobra competition chassis and said, "Take that car and make it mine. Take out the 4-speed, put in an automatic, and add 2 blowers to it." Staring at each other in disbelief, they knew that what rolled out of that shop would be unlike any Cobra ever built. The car that couldn't be tamed. Well, Shelby's order set his crew in motion. They took that unused Cobra chassis, CSX 3015, and rebuilt it stronger from the ground up. Out went the 4-speed, replaced by a Lincoln C6 automatic, picked because it was one of the few transmissions at the time they had that was strong enough to take the torque. Then came twin Paxton superchargers, feeding a 427 cubic inch Ford V8, an engine Ford had engineered specifically for their racing programs. But the target this time wasn't the racetrack or a stopwatch, it was a Ferrari. When asked later why he'd built such a crazy monster, Shelby joked that he'd spent one too many trips looking at nothing but Ferrari taillights. Shelby never issued an official horsepower figure on the car, but his shop estimated around 800. More conservative reports placed it closer to 650 or 700 horsepower, still more than double Mullins' Ferrari. Road and Track later recorded a 0 to 60 mile an hour time in just over 3 seconds. Quarter-mile times were in the low 11s and claimed a top speed near 190 miles an hour. Numbers that would stand tall even decades later. Shelby kept the first car, CSX 3015. The second they built, CSX 3303, went to comedian Bill Cosby, who returned it after one terrifying drive. His 1968 comedy album 200 Miles an Hour told the story, half in laughter and half in shock, that Carroll Shelby had tried to kill him. Later, businessman Tony Maxey thought he might be able to tame the second car, and he couldn't. While driving Highway 1 near Pacifica, California, he went through a guardrail and off a cliff into the Pacific Ocean. Maxey later died from his injuries, and the car, of course, was lost, adding a little credence to Cosby's jest. Meanwhile, back in Lake Tahoe, Carroll Shelby finally settled the score. Mr. Mullen was asked about Shelby's new ride. All he could say was, "It ate my Ferrari alive." The last snake standing. There was only one twin-supercharged 427 Cobra remaining, Carroll Shelby's own. He kept it in Torrance, California, using it for demonstrations, but to Shelby, it was just another car, as he was a man always looking for the next big idea. By 1970, Shelby had actually stepped away from small-volume production of automobiles and sold the car to songwriter Jimmy Webb, the man who wrote Wichita Lineman and MacArthur Park. Webb paid $10,000 and kept the car for about 25 years, rarely driving it. In 1995, the Internal Revenue Service seized the car from Webb over unpaid taxes. At the subsequent government auction, CSX 3015 sold for roughly $375,000, and the car quietly moved into private hands. Moving forward to 2007 at the Barrett-Jackson Scottsdale auction, the car sold for $5.5 million, setting a record for any Shelby Cobra. It was traded again in 2015 for $5.115 million, and once more in 2021 for, again, $5.5 million. Across those decades, it remained largely untouched. Few Cobras today are still this complete, and it's really more of just a showpiece. a reference point to how far American performance came in one short decade. However, truth be told, it was a car that was probably so scary to drive that no one dared to touch it. The end of the line. By 1967, the Cobra had gone from champion of speed and the racetrack to a liability. Dealers who sold them, mostly Ford dealers, were having a hard time moving them. In fact, customers who thought they wanted race car power found out too late that they'd bought exactly that. The 427 was brutally fast, rough riding, and quite unforgiving. Not to mention, it didn't even have a roof. Insurance companies didn't want it either. Because of this, cars would sit on showrooms for months, discounted, traded, or even parked out back to make room for cars that would sell. Not that Americans weren't seeking after horsepower. Believe me, the muscle cars were at the height at that time, but it was hard to want that kind of power without a backseat. In fact, there's a certain irony in how it all ended. The Cobra wasn't rocket science. It was quite a simple idea. That's something that Europe had been doing for years. However, in this case, a lightweight British chassis was taken and given reliable American horsepower. Less than a decade later, it finished as something too fast to sell, too dangerous to drive, and now too valuable to risk. Of the nearly 1,000 Cobras that were built during its run, about 900 are still estimated to be around. And strangely enough, the least of these cars is worth well over $1 million. All dreamed up by a big Texan who believed that America could beat the European manufacturers at their own game. Which he actually did, by the way, winning the 1965 World Manufacturers Championship, proving his approach worked. Simple, strong, and brutally fast. The Super Snake was not just his final expression, because there were several cars he had a hand in after that, but it is an example that persistence and a lot of horsepower pays off in the end. Today, if you follow the same route they drove west, across Nevada and over the Sierra on US 50, you'll still pass through the same country that shaped this story. But just like horses, stagecoaches, the first cars, and the Super Snake itself, they all belong to another time. And yet the trail through the mountains and the road today still remain. So if you're out there, be sure and stop to listen long enough. You might be able to still catch it. A faint echoing rolling off the hill, the sound of something powerful that once passed through, and yet still remains. Well, we hope you enjoyed our story about Carroll Shelby and US 50 creating the legendary Super Snake. Maybe you've got a story that you'd like to tell about that stretch of US 50 up and around Lake Tahoe and through the Sierra Nevadas. If so, leave us a comment down below. We're very active there. Also, if you like this video, if you could, go ahead and click that like button. That helps it go a lot further on YouTube. That and sharing it with other friends that you think might enjoy it. You know, we love telling stories from the roads that move us. And if that's something you enjoy, hearing those kind of histories, then why don't you join us on this caravan by subscribing to the channel? Here at Beyond the Exit, we're always looking for history hiding in plain sight. And a lot of times it's just waiting there to be rediscovered. We want to thank you a lot for watching and being here. And God bless.